Sometimes loneliness weighs heavier than any burden a man can carry on his back. Jeremiah Pike knew that weight well, living alone on his mountain homestead where the silence stretched longer than the shadows at dusk. He paid $10 for an old donkey, half blind and stubborn, just to have something breathing beside him. The rancher who sold the animal seemed in a hurry to leave. For a week, Jeremiah and the donkey worked the land together, two old souls finding comfort in simple routine. Then the rancher returned, riding slow with his hat pulled low and carrying an old feed sack. Inside was something that would shatter 40 years of silence. What could connect a $10 donkey to the brother Jeremiah thought he'd lost forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain had a way of keeping secrets, and Jeremiah Pike had become one of them. For 23 years, he'd lived in the shadow of the Bitterroot Range, where the pines grew so thick you could lose yourself in them and never be found. His cabin sat on a gentle slope overlooking a valley that turned gold in September and white as bone by November. It was the kind of place where a man could hear his own thoughts too clearly, where the past had room to spread out and make itself comfortable. Jeremiah was 62 years old. Though his hands looked older and his eyes looked younger, he had the build of someone who'd worked hard all his life but never broke himself doing it, lean and strong, in the way of men who split their own wood and carried their own water. His hair had gone silver at the temples first, then gradually claimed the rest, and he wore it long enough to tie back when he was working. His face was weathered from sun and wind, lined in places that told you he'd done his share of smiling, though those days seemed further behind him now. He'd come to the mountain after Martha died. That was how he marked time now, before Martha and after Martha. Before, there had been a house in Helena, a job at the lumber mill, Sunday dinners with friends, and a life that felt full even when it was ordinary. After Martha, there was only the cabin, the land, and the work that kept him moving through the days. She'd been gone 5 years, but he still set 2 cups out sometimes in the morning before he remembered. Still turned to tell her something before the silence reminded him she wasn't there to hear it. The cabin itself was solid and simple, built by someone who knew what winter meant in these mountains. One main room with a stone fireplace that could heat the whole place if you fed it right, a smaller bedroom off to the side, and a loft where Jeremiah stored supplies and the things he couldn't quite throw away. The furniture was spare. A table he'd built himself, 2 chairs that didn't match, a rocker by the fireplace that had been Martha's, and a narrow bed that felt too wide now. The walls were chink-tight against the cold, and the windows faced east to catch the morning light. Outside, there was a small barn that leaned slightly to the north, a chicken coop that housed 6 hens, who'd stopped laying regularly but still earned their keep, and a garden plot that produced enough vegetables to see him through winter if he canned properly. He had a root cellar dug into the hillside, lined with stone and cool even in summer, where he kept potatoes, carrots, and the preserves he put up each fall. It was a life pared down to essentials in most days. That suited him fine. The nearest town was Millerville, population 463, though that number had been painted on the welcome sign for at least a decade, and probably wasn't accurate anymore. It was a 40-minute drive down a dirt road that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter, and Jeremiah made the trip once a month for supplies. He bought flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, and whatever else he couldn't grow or make himself. The folks in town knew him by sight but not by story, and that was how he preferred it. They'd nod, say hello, ask about the weather. He'd answer politely and move on. There was a general store run by a woman named Caroline Brennan, who'd inherited it from her father and ran it with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it all her life. She was probably 50, with grey-streaked brown hair she kept in a braid and a manner that was warm without being intrusive. She never asked Jeremiah questions he didn't want to answer, but she always made sure he had what he needed. Sometimes she'd slip an extra can of peaches into his order, or a bag of peppermints, and when he tried to pay, she'd wave him off. Small kindnesses that reminded him the world still had gentle places in it. The postmaster was a man named Eugene Hartley, thin as a fence post and twice as rigid, who'd been sorting mail in Millerville for 30 years. He knew everyone's business because he handled everyone's letters, though he had the decency not to spread gossip. Jeremiah didn't get much mail, a catalogue now and then, a notice from the county about property taxes. Occasionally, a letter from Martha's sister in Boise, who still checked in on him despite his terrible habit of not writing back. Eugene always handed over his mail with a solemn nod, as if delivering important documents rather than junk circulars. Then there was Doc Mercer, who'd been the town physician since before Jeremiah moved to the mountain. He was older than Jeremiah by at least 10 years. With white hair that stuck up in odd directions and a habit of peering at you over his reading glasses, like he could diagnose what ailed you just by looking. He'd treated Jeremiah once for a gash on his forearm from a saw blade that slipped, and another time for a fever that wouldn't break. Both times, he'd refused payment beyond a cord of firewood, which Jeremiah delivered and stacked without a word. These were the people who made up the edges of Jeremiah's world now. Good people, decent people, but not close. He'd learned after Martha that closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. Better to keep things cordial and distant, to nod and smile and keep moving. The mountain had taught him you could survive alone if you were careful, if you didn't ask for much, if you made peace with silence. But silence had a way of growing heavy, especially in winter when the snow piled high and the days were short. That was when Jeremiah felt Martha's absence most keenly, when the cabin seemed too quiet and his own thoughts too loud. He'd take to talking to himself sometimes, narrating his actions, just to hear a human voice. "Need to check the chimney," he'd say aloud, or "that stew's coming along nice." Small things that made the loneliness feel less absolute. He'd considered getting a dog more than once. Dogs were good company, loyal and uncomplicated. But every time he thought about it seriously, he remembered the dog they'd had in Helena, a border collie named Jess, who'd been smart as a whip and twice as energetic. Jess had died a year before Martha, and the grief of it had been like a preview of what was coming. He didn't know if he could handle that kind of loss again. The way an animal could burrow into your heart and then leave a hole when they went. So he'd settled into a routine that kept him busy without requiring companionship. Up at dawn, coffee and oatmeal, then out to feed the chickens and check the fence lines. Mornings were for the heavy work, chopping wood, repairing whatever needed repairing, hauling water from the spring that fed into his cistern. Afternoons were quieter, tending the garden in season, reading by the window, sometimes working on small carpentry projects that he'd sell in town. Evenings were for supper, a fire if it was cold, and the long stretch of darkness before sleep. He'd been living this way for 5 years when he decided, on a cool morning in early October, that he needed something to change. Not something big. He wasn't ready for big changes, but something. The silence had started to feel less like peace and more like absence, and he found himself talking to the chickens more than was probably healthy. He needed a presence, something alive that required his attention, something that would look at him and acknowledge he was there. That was when he remembered seeing a notice on the board outside the general store the last time he'd been in town. Someone was selling livestock, goats maybe, or a milk cow. He couldn't recall exactly, but he decided his next trip to Millerville would include a stop to check it out. Maybe a goat would be good. They were hardy, didn't need much, and they had personality. Or a cow, though that seemed like more work than he wanted to take on. 3 days later, he loaded his truck and made the drive down the mountain. It was one of those October mornings when the air was so crisp it almost hurt to breathe, and the aspen leaves were turning that particular shade of yellow that looked like sunlight made solid. The road was dry and the truck ran smooth, and for a moment, Jeremiah felt something close to contentment. In town, he parked in front of the general store and went through his usual routine, exchanged greetings with Carolyn, picked up his supplies, loaded them in the truck. Then he walked over to the community board to look at the notice he'd remembered. But when he got there, That particular card was gone. In its place was a handwritten note that simply said, "Donkey for sale. $10. See Harlan Briggs at the end of Cedar Road." Jeremiah stood there for a moment, reading it again. A donkey. He'd never considered a donkey. They were stubborn creatures, famously so, but they were also steady and long-lived. Good for packing supplies, pulling a cart, keeping predators away from chickens. And $10 was about as cheap as a living creature could get, which made him wonder what was wrong with it. But something about the simplicity of it appealed to him. A donkey wasn't fancy. It wasn't asking for much. It was practical in the way mountain life demanded practicality. And $10 wasn't going to break him either way. He asked Caroline if she knew Harlan Briggs, and she nodded. "Has a small ranch out past the lumberyard. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's decent enough. Why?" "He's selling a donkey," Jeremiah said. Caroline raised her eyebrows. "That old thing? I saw it last time I drove out that way. Must be ancient. But if you're looking for company, I suppose a donkey's as good as anything." Jeremiah thanked her and drove out to Cedar Road, which turned out to be more of a track than a road, winding through scrub pine and open grassland. Harlan Briggs's place was small and worn-looking, with a house that needed paint and a barn that needed everything. The man himself came out when Jeremiah pulled up, tall and gaunt, with a face that looked like it had been carved from hard years and harder choices. He was probably in his 60s, though he could have been older. "Help you?" Harlan asked, his voice rough as gravel. "Saw your notice about the donkey," Jeremiah said. Harlan nodded toward the barn. "He's out back. Fair warning, he's 40 years old if he's a day. Blind in one eye, stubborn in both. But he's sound enough, and he don't eat much." They walked around to a small paddock where the donkey stood in the shade of a cottonwood tree. He was grey around the muzzle and ears, shaggy-coated, with one eye that had gone milky white and the other that watched them with what looked like weary patience. He was smaller than Jeremiah expected, maybe 13 hands, and he stood with one back hoof cocked in a way that suggested he'd been standing there a very long time and planned to keep standing there indefinitely. "What's his name?" Jeremiah asked. "Never gave him one," Harlan said. "Just called him Donkey." Jeremiah walked closer, and the donkey turned his good eye toward him. There was something in that gaze, not quite recognition, but not indifference either. More like acknowledgement, like the donkey was saying, "I see you and I'm too old to pretend I care, but I see you. Why are you selling him?" Jeremiah asked. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Got to move on. Can't take him with me. Rather he went to someone who'll treat him right than send him to auction." It wasn't the whole truth. Jeremiah could tell that much, but it was enough of the truth to matter. He pulled out his wallet and counted out $10. "I'll take him." Harlan looked almost relieved. He fetched a worn halter and rope from the barn and helped Jeremiah load the donkey into the back of his truck, which the animal did with surprising cooperation, as if he'd decided this was acceptable and saw no reason to make a fuss about it. As Jeremiah was about to leave, Harlan put a hand on the truck door. "Treat him kind," he said, and there was something in his voice that went deeper than simple concern. "He deserves that much." Jeremiah nodded and Harlan stepped back. The whole exchange had taken maybe 20 minutes, but it felt weighted with more than the transaction itself, like he'd taken on something that mattered in ways he didn't quite understand yet. The drive back up the mountain was slow and careful, and when Jeremiah got the donkey unloaded and into the barn, he stood there for a moment watching the animal sniff around his new surroundings. The donkey seemed unbothered by the change, as if one place was much the same as another when you'd lived as long as he had. "Need to call you something," Jeremiah said aloud. The donkey flicked an ear in his direction. "How about Samson? You look like you've carried a few burdens in your time." The donkey didn't object, which Jeremiah took as agreement. He filled a water bucket, spread fresh hay, and left Samson to settle in. As he walked back to the cabin, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite happiness, but close. Like maybe the silence wouldn't be quite so heavy now. The week that followed was one of the best Jeremiah had experienced in years. Samson settled into life on the mountain like he'd always belonged there, and Jeremiah found himself talking to the donkey the way he used to talk to Martha, not expecting answers, just appreciating the company. They fell into an easy rhythm together, two old souls who understood that companionship didn't require constant noise or effort. Mornings, Jeremiah would lead Samson out to help with the work. The donkey couldn't see well on his blind side, so Jeremiah learned to approach from the right, speaking softly so as not to startle him. Samson would follow along as they checked fence lines, carried tools, hauled firewood from the cutting area back to the cabin. He moved slowly but steadily, never complaining, never balking. In the evenings, they'd stand together at the edge of the property, looking out over the valley as the sun dropped behind the mountains. Jeremiah would rest a hand on Samson's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal, the solid reality of another living thing beside him. "You and me, we've both seen some years," Jeremiah said one evening, scratching behind Samson's ears. "Both got a few more miles left in us, though." Samson blew out a breath through his nostrils, which Jeremiah chose to interpret as agreement. But on the 8th day, a Thursday morning when frost still clung to the grass in shadowed places, Jeremiah heard the sound of a truck coming up the road. He set down the axe he'd been using to split kindling and walked around to the front of the cabin. Samson, who'd been grazing nearby, lifted his head and watched too. The truck that came into view was the same battered Ford that Harlan Briggs had been standing beside when Jeremiah bought the donkey. It moved slowly, and when it finally stopped, the engine idled for a long moment before cutting off. Harlan climbed out, and Jeremiah saw immediately that something was wrong. The man looked like he'd aged 10 years in 8 days. His face was drawn, his shoulders hunched, and he moved with the heaviness of someone carrying guilt that had finally become unbearable. "Mr. Pike," Harlan said, his voice even rougher than Jeremiah remembered. "Harlan," Jeremiah replied, walking closer. "Everything all right?" Harlan took off his hat and turned it in his hands. "No, sir, it ain't. I need to talk to you about that donkey." Jeremiah felt something tighten in his chest. "He's settling in fine. No problems at all." "That's good," Harlan said, but he didn't sound relieved. "But there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you when you bought him." He walked back to his truck and reached into the cab, pulling out an old canvas feed sack that had been folded over several times. It was weathered and stained, the kind of thing that had been used hard and put away dirty. He held it with both hands, like it might break if he wasn't careful. 42 years ago, Harlan began, his voice shaking slightly. "I worked for a man named William Pike. He had a gold claim up in the Tobacco Root Mountains. I was young then, maybe 22, and he hired me on as a hand. Good man, fair man." Jeremiah went very still. Pike wasn't a common name in these mountains. "William had a younger brother," Harlan continued. Name was Jeremiah. Called him Jerry. He'd come up to the claim sometimes, help out during the busy season. The two of them were close as brothers could be. The world seemed to tilt slightly under Jeremiah's feet. He reached out and steadied himself against the porch railing. "One day," Harlan said, and his voice cracked, "there was an accident, a cave-in at the claim. William was inside when it happened. We tried to dig him out, worked for 3 days straight, but by the time we got to him, he was gone. And Jerry, your brother Jerry, he was there when we pulled William out. I watched something break in that boy." Jeremiah felt like all the air had been pulled from his lungs. William, his brother William, who'd left home when Jeremiah was 17, who'd written letters for the first few years and then stopped, who'd become a ghost in the family story. "Jerry disappeared after the funeral," Harlan said. "Just vanished. Didn't settle William's affairs, didn't take nothing from the claim. And he stopped, swallowed hard. "I did something I ain't proud of. I took what was William's, the deed to the claim, his personal effects, buried it all away like it never existed." He held out the feed sack toward Jeremiah. "This is what belonged to your brother William. The deed to the claim is in here, still in his name. Letters he wrote to Jerry but never sent. A journal he kept, and information about where he's buried. It's been eating at me for 40 years, Mr. Pike." Jeremiah took the sack with hands that didn't feel like his own. "The donkey," Harlan said. his voice barely above a whisper. That was William's donkey. He called him Sam, loved that animal more than anything except his brother. When William died, I took Sam too, but he outlived my greed. 40 years that donkey's been with me, and every day he looked at me like he knew, like he was waiting for me to do the right thing. Tears were running down Harlan's weathered face now. When you came asking about him, and I saw your name, Jeremiah Pike, I knew it was time to set things right. That donkey was meant to bring you back to your brother. So I'm telling you now, and I'm asking for you to forgive an old fool who let fear and greed rule him for too long. Jeremiah stood there, the feed sack in his hands, his mind reeling through 40 years of absence and loss. He'd thought William had simply moved on, forgotten about his younger brother. He'd carried that abandonment like a stone in his chest, had let it shape how he thought about family, about connection, about whether people stayed or left. And all this time, William had been dead, had died thinking about him, writing letters he never got to send. Where is he buried? Jeremiah asked, his voice hoarse. Little cemetery outside of Twin Bridges, Harlan said. I can draw you a map. Jeremiah looked over at Samson, who'd wandered closer and was watching them both with his one good eye. The donkey that had belonged to William. The donkey that had been waiting 40 years to come home. You kept him alive, Jeremiah said finally. 40 years you kept my brother's donkey alive. It's the one decent thing I did, Harlan replied. Then that's something, Jeremiah said. He looked back at Harlan, saw the broken man standing before him, saw the weight of 4 decades of guilt. I don't know if I can forgive you yet. Don't know if I have that in me right now. But I'm grateful you came back. Grateful you told me. Harlan nodded, wiping at his face with a shaking hand. I'm leaving Montana. Going to live with my daughter in Oregon. Couldn't go without setting this right. The claim might still be worth something. There's a company been buying up old mining rights in that area. The information's all in the sack. He walked back to his truck, pulled out a piece of paper, and handed it to Jeremiah. That's the map to the cemetery. And my daughter's address. If you ever want to reach me. Jeremiah took it, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket. Harlan climbed into his truck, started the engine, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Then he looked out at Jeremiah one last time. Your brother was a good man, and he loved you. Talked about you all the time. You meant the world to him. Then he drove away, the truck rattling back down the mountain road until it disappeared into the trees. Jeremiah stood there for a long time, the feed sack in his arms, watching the place where the truck had vanished. Samson walked up beside him and pressed his shoulder against Jeremiah's leg, warm and solid and real. Sam, Jeremiah said softly. Your name was Sam. The donkey turned his good eye up toward him, and in that look, Jeremiah saw recognition, saw memory, saw 40 years of waiting finally come to an end. He carried the feed sack inside and set it on the table. His hands were shaking as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the things Harlan had described. A deed to a mining claim in William Pike's name. A leather journal, the pages yellowed and brittle. A bundle of letters tied with string, each one addressed to Jerry Pike in William's careful handwriting. And at the bottom, a photograph in a tarnished silver frame. Jeremiah lifted the photograph and felt his throat close. It showed 2 young men standing in front of a mine entrance, both grinning, arms around each other's shoulders. One was clearly William, and the other was himself, 17 years old. He'd forgotten that photo existed, forgotten that moment when everything had seemed possible. He sat down heavily in the chair, the photograph in his hands, and let himself cry for the first time since Martha died. Cried for his brother, gone 40 years without him knowing. Cried for the letters never received, the words never spoken. Cried for all the years he'd thought himself abandoned when really he'd been grieved for. Outside, through the window, he could see Sam standing in the yard, patient and still, like he'd been standing for 40 years, waiting to bring 2 brothers back together, even if one of them was only a ghost now. Jeremiah pressed the photograph to his chest and whispered, I'm sorry, William. I'm so sorry I didn't know. In the silence of the cabin, he felt something shift. The weight he'd carried for so long, the weight of abandonment, of being left behind, began to lift. In its place came a different weight, but one that felt more bearable. The weight of grief, yes, but also of connection, of being loved enough to be remembered. He sat there until the light began to fade, and then he carefully gathered the contents of the feed sack and placed them on the shelf beside Martha's things. 2 losses, 2 kinds of grief, but also 2 kinds of love that nothing had managed to erase. Tomorrow he would read William's journal. Tomorrow he would open those letters. Tomorrow he would drive to Twin Bridges and stand at his brother's grave. But tonight he would sit with this new knowledge, this gift that had come to him through a $10 donkey and a guilty man's confession. Jeremiah didn't sleep that night. He sat at the table with William's journal open in front of him, a kerosene lamp casting flickering shadows across the yellowed pages. The handwriting was unmistakably his brother's, careful, deliberate strokes that formed words with the same precision William had always brought to everything he did. The journal started in the spring of 1983, just after William had staked his claim in the Tobacco Root Mountains. The early entries were practical, almost businesslike. Notes about ore quality, equipment needs, weather conditions. But as Jeremiah read deeper, he began to see his brother emerge from between the lines, not just the prospector, but the man. "Jerry turns 18 next month," one entry read. "Wish I could be there for it. Sent him a letter and what money I could spare. That boy's got more sense in his little finger than I've got in my whole head." Jeremiah traced the words with his finger, feeling the distance of 40 years collapse into nothing. He'd received that letter, remembered it clearly now. $20 and a note saying, "Buy yourself something good." He'd used it to purchase a used guitar, had taught himself to play that summer. Another entry, dated 3 months later. "Harlan's working out well. Good kid, strong back, doesn't complain. But he's got a hungry look about him sometimes. The kind of hunger that makes men do foolish things." Jeremiah felt a chill reading those words. William had seen it, had recognized the weakness in Harlan Briggs even then, and still he'd trusted him. The journal went on, chronicling the daily struggles of working a small claim, equipment failures, promising veins that played out, the constant battle against water and unstable rock. But threaded through it all were mentions of Jerry, references to letters sent and received, plans for a visit that kept getting postponed, dreams of the day when the claim would pay off enough that William could help his younger brother build a life. Jerry wrote that he's thinking about apprenticing as a carpenter, one entry noted. Says he likes working with his hands. That's good. Honest work. Better than gambling on holes in the ground like his fool brother. There was pride in those words, and love, and a kind of wistfulness that made Jeremiah's chest ache. William had been rooting for him from a distance, had been there in ways Jeremiah had never fully understood until now. The entries became less frequent as summer turned to fall. William wrote about feeling tired, about pains in his chest that he attributed to hard work and thin mountain air. He wrote about a particularly rich vein he'd found, one that might finally be the breakthrough he'd been hoping for. The last entry was dated October 15th, 1983. Just 3 sentences. "Cave's getting unstable. Should probably shore it up before going deeper. But the ore's so good here, and I'm so close to something that could change everything." That was it. The journal ended there, mid-hope, mid-dream. 2 days later, the cave had collapsed with William inside. Jeremiah closed the journal carefully and sat in the silence. Dawn was starting to break outside, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. He felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except a grief so old and new at the same time that he didn't know how to hold it. Sam was visible through the window, standing in his usual spot by the fence. The animal hadn't moved much since Harlan left, as if he too was processing the weight of revelation. The return of a name he'd carried for 40 years. Jeremiah stood, joints stiff from sitting so long, and walked outside. The morning air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. He approached Sam slowly and rested his hand on the donkey's warm neck. "He loved you," Jeremiah said quietly. "I can tell from how he wrote about you. Called you his four-legged partner." Sam turned his good eye toward Jeremiah, and for a moment they just stood there together. Two beings bound by their connection to a man who'd been gone for 40 years, but somehow felt present. "I'm going to read his letters today," Jeremiah continued. "The ones he wrote to me but never sent. I don't know if I'm ready for that, but I don't think waiting will make it any easier." He fed Sam, checked his water, then went back inside. The bundle of letters sat on the table where he'd left them, still tied with the same string William had used. There were 12 letters in all, each one sealed in an envelope that had yellowed with age but never been opened. Jeremiah picked up the first one, dated June 1983. His hands shook as he carefully opened it, trying not to tear the fragile paper. Inside was a single sheet covered in William's handwriting. "Dear Jerry," it began. "I've been meaning to write this letter for weeks now, but every time I sit down to do it, I don't know where to start. There's so much I want to tell you. I guess I'll start with the simple truth. I miss you, little brother. Miss you more than I thought possible." The letter went on to describe William's life at the claim, but not in the practical terms of the journal. This was personal, intimate. He wrote about loneliness, about second-guessing his decision to leave, about wondering if the search for gold was worth the cost of distance from family. He wrote about their childhood, about memories Jeremiah had half forgotten, the time they'd built a treehouse together, the summer they'd spent fishing at the lake. "I know you probably think I abandoned you," William wrote near the end. "Probably think I chose this life over being your brother. But that's not true, Jerry. You're with me every day. Every decision I make, I think about whether it'll make you proud. I'm not running from you. I'm running toward something I hope will bring us both a better future." The letter was signed simply, "Your brother, William." Jeremiah had to stop reading. He set the letter down and walked outside again, needing air, needing space to contain the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He'd spent 40 years thinking William had forgotten about him, had moved on to a life where his younger brother didn't matter. And all that time, these letters had existed, proof that the opposite was true. He thought about his own life after William left, how he'd felt abandoned, betrayed even, how that feeling had colored his relationships, made him hesitant to get too close to people, because closeness meant the risk of being left behind. Even with Martha, there had been a part of him that had held back, waiting for the day she'd realize he wasn't worth staying for. But she had stayed, had loved him completely and without reservation until cancer took her 5 years ago. And now, learning about William, learning the truth of how his brother had felt, Jeremiah realized he'd wasted so much energy protecting himself from a hurt that had been based on a misunderstanding. The sun was fully up now, warming the mountain air. Sam had wandered over to stand beside him, and Jeremiah reached down to scratch the donkey's ears. "I've been a fool," he said aloud. "Spent my whole life being afraid of the wrong things." He went back inside and picked up the second letter. Then the third, then the fourth. He read them all through the morning, each one adding another layer to his understanding of who William had been, what he'd felt, what he'd hoped for. The letters painted a picture of a man who'd been lonely but determined, uncertain but brave, who'd loved his brother fiercely even across the distance that separated them. The last letter was different from the others. It was dated October 10th, 1983, just 5 days before the accident. The handwriting was less careful, more hurried, and there was an urgency to the words that made Jeremiah's heart beat faster. "Jerry," it began, "I think I've finally found it. The vein I've been chasing for 2 years. It's rich, Jerry, richer than anything I've seen before. If this plays out the way I think it will, everything changes. I can pay off the claim, set aside money for your future, maybe even buy a little place where we could both live. Somewhere we could be brothers again." The letter continued with details about the vein, about William's plans for extraction, about his dreams for what the money could do. And then, near the end, a passage that made Jeremiah's breath catch. "I know I haven't been the brother you deserved. No, I've been absent when I should have been present. But I want you to know that every choice I've made, it's all been for you. You're the reason I keep going when the work gets hard. And soon, Jerry, soon I'll be able to show you that it was all worth it, that I never forgot you." The letter ended there, unsigned, as if William had been interrupted or had run out of time. 3 days after writing it, he was dead. Jeremiah sat with that final letter for a long time, reading it again and again until the words blurred together. William had been on the verge of something that could have changed both their lives, had been working toward a reunion, toward a future where they could be brothers again. And then everything had ended in darkness and rock and silence. He carefully placed all the letters back in their bundle and tied the string with trembling fingers. These weren't just pieces of paper. They were pieces of William's heart, preserved for 40 years, waiting for someone to hear what he'd wanted to say. But there was still the deed. The mining claim that William had died working. Jeremiah unfolded the document carefully. It was official-looking, stamped and signed, declaring that William Andrew Pike was the legal owner of a claim designated as Lot 47 in the Tobacco Root Mining District. Filed on March 12, 1983, the essential fact was clear. This claim had belonged to William, and by rights of inheritance, it now belonged to Jeremiah. He tried to imagine what the claim might look like now, after 40 years of abandonment. Probably overgrown, collapsed in places, reclaimed by the mountain. Whatever riches might have been there were likely lost forever, sealed behind tons of rock and earth. But Harlan had mentioned something about a company buying up old mining rights in the area. That suggested the land itself might have value. Jeremiah wasn't a man who cared much about money, but the thought that William's dream might still have worth sparked a small flame of hope in his chest. He decided he needed to see it, needed to stand where William had stood, see what William had seen. It felt important, necessary even, like a pilgrimage to a place that held pieces of a story he was only now beginning to understand. The next morning, Jeremiah loaded Sam into the truck and made the drive to Twin Bridges first. The cemetery was small and old, set on a hillside with a view of the valley below. Harlan's directions led him to a section near the back, where the stones were simple and weathered. William's marker was modest grey granite. It bore his name, his dates, 1960 to 1983, and nothing else. 23 years old when he died. Too young to be gone, too young to have all his dreams cut short. Jeremiah stood before the stone with Sam beside him, the donkey's presence somehow making the moment more bearable. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and wildflowers grew in patches nearby. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," Jeremiah said, his voice catching. "Sorry I didn't know. Sorry I spent all these years thinking you'd left me behind when you were thinking about me the whole time." Sam shifted his weight and blew out a soft breath, as if offering his own form of acknowledgement. "I read your letters," Jeremiah continued. "All of them. And your journal. I know now what you were trying to do. I know you loved me, William. I know that now." He knelt and placed his hand on the stone, feeling the cool smoothness of the granite. This was real. This was where his brother had ended up, beneath Montana's soil, waiting 40 years for someone to come and remember him properly. "I'm going to go see the claim," Jeremiah said. "I'm going to see what you were working toward. And I'm going to figure out what to do with it. I promise you that." He stayed there for another hour, just sitting beside the grave, talking sometimes and other times just being present. Sam grazed nearby, patient and calm, and Jeremiah felt grateful for the animal's steady presence. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, Jeremiah stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "I'll come back," he promised. "Won't let you be alone here anymore." The drive to the Tobacco Root Mountains took another 2 hours, following roads that got progressively narrower and rougher. But he pressed on, using the coordinates from the deed and an old mining district map he'd picked up at a general store along the way. The claim was harder to find than he'd expected. 40 years of growth had obscured what had once been clear paths and landmarks. But eventually, following a creek bed and then climbing a steep slope, Jeremiah found what he was looking for. The mine entrance was there, just as he'd imagined, collapsed and overgrown, barely visible beneath a tangle of brush and fallen timber. A rusted piece of equipment lay nearby, half buried in earth and leaves. There were remnants of a small structure, probably a shed for tools. Now, just a few standing posts and scattered boards. Jeremiah stood at the edge of what had once been William's workspace and tried to picture his brother here. Young, strong, full of hope and determination. Swinging a pick, hauling rock, believing that the next strike might be the one that changed everything. Sam had followed him up the slope, moving slowly but steadily, and now stood beside Jeremiah, looking at the scene with his one good eye. "This is where it happened," Jeremiah said quietly. "This is where we lost him." He walked closer to the collapsed entrance, careful of his footing on the unstable ground. The rock face showed signs of the cave-in. A massive section had given way, sealing the tunnel completely. There would be no going back in there without heavy equipment and expertise that Jeremiah didn't have. But as he examined the site more closely, something caught his eye. A glint of metal, partially exposed, where recent rain had washed away some soil. He knelt and brushed at the dirt, uncovering what looked like a metal box, the kind used to store documents or valuables. His heart beating faster, Jeremiah worked to free the box from the earth. It was locked, but the mechanism was rusted through, and it took only a few strikes with a rock to break it open. Inside, protected by the metal casing, were more papers. A survey report, dated just days before the accident, detailing the mineral content of the vein William had been working. Jeremiah's eyes widened as he read the figures. The ore was rich, far richer than he'd imagined. If the survey was accurate, William had been sitting on a deposit worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, even by 1983 standards. There was also a rough map, drawn in William's handwriting, showing the layout of the tunnels and marking the location of the richest vein. And at the bottom of the box, a letter addressed to the county mining office, never sent, requesting an updated survey and expressing William's intention to expand operations. Jeremiah sat back on his heels, the papers in his hands, and felt the full weight of what had been lost. William had been right there, on the edge of success, and then it had all ended in an instant. The dream had died with him, buried under rock and forgotten by everyone, except a guilty man and a patient donkey. But now Jeremiah knew what William had found, what he'd been working toward, what he'd hoped to give his younger brother. And Harlan had been right. If a company was buying up old mining rights, this claim could be worth something substantial. The question was, what should he do with it? He looked over at Sam, who was watching him with that steady, knowing gaze. "What do you think, old friend? What would William want me to do?" Sam didn't answer, of course, but Jeremiah felt like he already knew. William hadn't been chasing gold for its own sake. He'd been chasing it for what it could provide: security, opportunity, a chance to help the people he loved. He'd been chasing it so he and his brother could have a future together. That future was 40 years too late now. But maybe, Jeremiah thought, there was still a way to honor what William had tried to do, still a way to make something meaningful come from all this loss and wasted time. He gathered the papers carefully and placed them back in the metal box. Then he stood, took one last long look at the collapsed mine entrance, and turned to walk back down the mountain with Sam at his side. He had decisions to make, hard ones. But for the first time in 5 years, maybe for the first time in 40 years, Jeremiah felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving each day. He had a brother to honor, a legacy to steward, and a donkey who'd waited 4 decades to bring a family story full circle. The mountain had kept its secrets long enough. Now it was time to see what could be built from what remained. Back at the cabin, Jeremiah spent the next few days trying to figure out his next move. The metal box sat on his table, its contents spread out like pieces of a puzzle he didn't quite know how to assemble. The survey report was technical, full of geological terms that meant little to him. But the numbers at the bottom, the estimated value of the deposit, those he understood well enough. William had been sitting on something worth a fortune. The question that kept Jeremiah awake at night was what to do with that knowledge now. He could try to reopen the mine himself, but that seemed foolish. He was 62 years old, with no mining experience and no equipment. The entrance was collapsed, and even if he could somehow clear it, going into an unstable tunnel alone would be suicide. William had died that way, and Jeremiah had no interest in following him. The other option was to sell the claim to the company Harlan had mentioned. That seemed more practical. Take whatever money they offered and live out his remaining years in comfort. Maybe fix up the cabin, buy a new truck, take a trip somewhere, but something about that option felt wrong. Felt like taking William's dream and reducing it to nothing more than a transaction. His brother hadn't died chasing money for its own sake. He died trying to build something that would help his family, that would create opportunities and a future they could share. Jeremiah found himself thinking about the town of Millerville, about the people there who'd shown him kindness over the years. Caroline at the general store, always slipping extra goods into his order. Doc Mercer, refusing payment beyond firewood. Eugene at the post office, treating his sparse mail like it mattered. These were good people in a small town that was slowly dying. Young people leaving, businesses closing, hope dwindling with each passing year. What if William's dream could become something that helped them? What if the value locked in that mountain could be turned into something meaningful for the community that had kept Jeremiah from disappearing entirely into his grief? The idea took root slowly. He didn't have all the details worked out yet, but he knew he needed help, needed guidance from someone who understood these things better than he did. He decided to start with Doc Mercer. The old physician had been in Millerville longer than anyone, had seen the town through good times and bad, and had a reputation for level-headed thinking. The drive down to town felt different this time. Jeremiah wasn't just going for supplies or out of routine. He was going with purpose, with questions that needed answers, with the beginnings of a plan that felt both terrifying and right. Doc Mercer's office was attached to his house, a small building on the edge of town. Jeremiah knocked and waited, hearing movement inside before the door opened. "Jeremiah," Doc Mercer said, peering over his reading glasses. "You sick? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not sick," Jeremiah replied. "But I need to talk to you about something. Something important." Doc Mercer stepped aside and gestured him in. The office was cluttered but clean, smelling of antiseptic and old books. They sat in 2 chairs by the window, and Jeremiah found himself unsure where to start. "I found out some things recently," he began slowly, "about my brother. He died 40 years ago working a mining claim up in the tobacco roots. I didn't know about it until last week." Doc Mercer's expression shifted to something softer. "I'm sorry to hear that. Must be hard learning about a loss so long after." "It is," Jeremiah said. "But that's not why I'm here." "The claim belonged to him, and now it belongs to me. And it turns out there's gold there. A lot of it, according to the survey he had done before he died." The old doctor raised his eyebrows. "That's so. I'm thinking about selling it," Jeremiah continued. "There's a company buying up old mining rights. But I don't want to just take the money and walk away. My brother died trying to build something that mattered. I want to honor that. Want to do something that would make him proud." "What did you have in mind?" Doc Mercer asked. "I was thinking about the town," Jeremiah said. "About what it needs, about what might help keep it alive for another generation. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I thought you might." Doc Mercer sat back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "This town's been bleeding for years. We need young families to stay, need jobs that pay decent wages, need infrastructure that works. The school needs repairs, the clinic needs equipment. But more than that, we need hope. Need people to believe there's a reason to stay instead of leaving for the cities. Could money help with that?" Jeremiah asked. "Money helps with everything," Doc Mercer replied. "But it's how you use it that matters. You could write a check to the county and watch it disappear into bureaucracy. Or you could be more deliberate about it. Create something specific, something tangible that people can see and believe in." "Like what?" Doc Mercer thought for a moment. "A community foundation, maybe. Something that funds local projects, helps small businesses get started, provides scholarships for kids who want to stay in the area. Something that keeps money circulating here instead of flowing out. Jeremiah felt something click into place. That was it. That was what William would have wanted. Not just wealth for its own sake, but wealth that built community, that created connections, that helped people build lives worth living. How would I go about doing something like that? He asked. You'd need a lawyer, Doc Mercer said. Someone who knows how to set up foundations and trusts. And you'd need people you trust to help run it, to make decisions about where the money goes. Don't be a one-man operation if you want it to last beyond your lifetime. Jeremiah nodded, his mind already turning over the possibilities. Would you be willing to help? To be part of something like that? Doc Mercer smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. I'd be honored. Your brother sounds like he was a good man. This would be a fine way to remember him. They talked for another hour, sketching out ideas and possibilities. Doc Mercer mentioned other people who might be willing to help. Caroline from the general store, the high school principal, a retired banker who still lived in town. People who cared about Millerville and wanted to see it survive. By the time Jeremiah left, he felt lighter than he had in days. The path forward wasn't completely clear yet, but he could see the outline of it. He had a purpose now, a mission that felt worthy of both William's memory and his own remaining years. On the drive back up the mountain, Jeremiah thought about his brother, about the letters that had never been sent, the reunion that had never happened, the future that had been stolen. He couldn't change any of that, couldn't bring William back or undo the lost decades, but he could take what William had left behind, the claim, the dream, the love that had persisted even through death and distance, and turn it into something living, something that would outlast both of them, something that would help people in the same way William had always wanted to help his younger brother. When he got home, Sam was waiting by the fence, patient as always. Jeremiah walked over and rested his hand on the donkey's neck. I think I figured it out, he said quietly. What we're going to do, what William would have wanted. It's going to take some time, going to take some work, but I think it's right. Sam turned his good eye toward Jeremiah, and in that look, he saw something like approval. Like the donkey understood that the long wait was finally bearing fruit. Jeremiah stood there as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. For the first time since Martha died, for the first time since learning about William's death, he felt at peace. Not happy exactly, the grief was still too fresh but peaceful, like he'd found solid ground after years of drifting. Tomorrow he would start making calls, would begin the process of turning ideas into reality. But tonight he would sit on his porch with Sam nearby and let himself feel grateful. Grateful for a $10 donkey who'd carried a secret for 40 years. Grateful for a guilty man who'd finally found the courage to do right. Grateful for a brother who'd loved him, even when he hadn't known it. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and coming winter, and Jeremiah breathed it in deeply, feeling more alive than he had in years. The following week brought a flurry of activity that felt foreign to Jeremiah after so many years of quiet routine. Doc Mercer had given him the name of a lawyer in Butte, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in estate planning and non-profit work. Jeremiah called her from the payphone outside the general store, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed the number. Sarah Chen had a voice that was both professional and warm, and she listened without interruption as Jeremiah explained the situation. The brother he'd lost 40 years ago, the mining claim, the desire to create something meaningful for Millerville. When he finished, there was a pause, and then she spoke. Mr. Pike, what you're describing is absolutely possible. It'll take some time to set up properly, but I think we can create something that honors your brother's memory and serves the community. Can you come to my office next week? They set an appointment for the following Tuesday. Jeremiah hung up, feeling both relieved and anxious. This was really happening. He was taking the first concrete steps toward turning William's legacy into something real. But before he could move forward with the foundation, he needed to know what the claim was actually worth. He needed to contact the mining company Harlan had mentioned and get a proper valuation. That meant making another call, this one even more intimidating than the first. Caroline helped him track down the information. The company was called Rockridge Resources, based out of Denver, and they'd been quietly acquiring mining rights throughout Montana for the past 5 years. Their interest wasn't in small-scale operations, but in the mineral rights themselves, the potential for future extraction if prices rose or technology improved. Jeremiah called them from his cabin, using the phone line he rarely touched, except for emergencies. He was transferred twice before reaching someone named Michael Torres, who introduced himself as a land acquisitions specialist. "Mr. Pike," Torres said after Jeremiah explained about the claim. "I'd need to see the documentation, of course, but if the survey you're describing is accurate, we'd definitely be interested. Mining claims in the Tobacco Root region have been particularly valuable to us. Would you be willing to meet in person to discuss terms?" They arranged to meet at the claim site itself the following week. Torres wanted to see the location, verify the boundaries, and assess the accessibility. Jeremiah agreed, though the thought of returning to that place with a stranger felt oddly intrusive, like bringing someone into a church where he'd only recently learned to pray. In the days that followed, Jeremiah found himself caught between two worlds, the quiet life he'd built on the mountain and this new world of lawyers and mining companies and community foundations. It was exhausting in ways he hadn't experienced in years, but it was also invigorating. He felt useful again, purposeful in a way that went beyond simple survival. Sam seemed to sense the change in him. The donkey followed him more closely now, as if understanding that something important was unfolding and wanting to be part of it. Jeremiah found himself talking to Sam even more than usual, working through his thoughts and fears aloud. "What if I mess this up?" he asked one evening as they stood watching the sunset. "What if I take William's dream and turn it into something he wouldn't recognize? Something that doesn't help anyone the way it's supposed to?" Sam flicked his ears and shifted his weight, offering no answers, but plenty of steady presence. "I guess that's the risk, isn't it?" Jeremiah continued, "Doing nothing guarantees nothing changes. Doing something means I might get it wrong. But at least I'll have tried. At least William's death won't have been for nothing." The meeting with Sarah Chen came first. Jeremiah drove to Butte on a cold Tuesday morning, the mountains white with fresh snow. Her office was in a converted house downtown, filled with books and warm lighting that made it feel more like a home than a workplace. Sarah herself was younger than he'd expected, probably in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She shook his hand firmly and gestured to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "Tell me more about your brother," she said, pulling out a legal pad. "Not just the facts, but who he was. What mattered to him? That'll help us shape the foundation in a way that reflects his values." So Jeremiah told her about William's letters and journal, about his desire to help his younger brother build a better life, about his belief that hard work and hope could overcome any obstacle, about the way he treated people with kindness and fairness, even Harlan Briggs, who'd ultimately betrayed him. Sarah took notes, nodding occasionally, and when Jeremiah finished, she looked up with something like admiration in her eyes. "Your brother sounds remarkable," she said. "And what you want to do, creating a foundation that invests in community, in young people, in keeping families together instead of forcing them apart. That's exactly the kind of legacy that lasts. Not just a name on a plaque, but something that changes lives." They spent the next 2 hours going over the details. Sarah explained how foundations worked, the legal requirements, the tax implications, the need for a board of trustees who could make decisions about grants and programs. She talked about mission statements and bylaws and annual reports. And while some of it went over Jeremiah's head, he trusted her to guide him through the complexity. "The first step is establishing the value of the claim," Sarah said. "Once we know what we're working with, we can determine the structure. If it's substantial enough, we might want to set it up as an endowment, invest the principal, and use the returns to fund programs indefinitely." That way, the foundation could operate for generations, not just a few years. Jeremiah liked that idea, like the thought of William's legacy continuing long after both of them were gone, helping people who hadn't even been born yet. The meeting with Michael Torres happened 3 days later. Jeremiah drove up to the claim site early, wanting to be there first, wanting to stand in that place alone before it became part of a business transaction. The mine entrance looked the same as it had weeks ago, collapsed, overgrown, holding its secrets beneath tons of rock. Jeremiah stood there for a moment, one hand resting on Sam's neck, and whispered a quiet prayer that what they were about to do was right. Torres arrived in a company truck, accompanied by a surveyor and a geologist. He was younger than Jeremiah expected, probably in his 30s, wearing outdoor gear that looked expensive and new. But he was respectful, shaking Jeremiah's hand and thanking him for making the trip. "This is quite a location," Torres said, looking around at the steep slopes and dense forest. "Remote, but the mineral rights are what matter to us, not the accessibility." The surveyor spent an hour walking the boundaries, taking measurements and GPS coordinates. The geologist examined the collapsed entrance and the rock faces, taking samples and making notes. Torres asked Jeremiah questions about the history of the claim, about William's work there, about the survey report from 1983. Finally, after conferring with his team, Torres turned to Jeremiah with a serious expression. "Based on what we're seeing and the documentation you've provided, I can make you an offer today. Pending final verification of the survey data and mineral rights, Rockridge Resources is prepared to offer $850,000 for the claim." The number hung in the air like something physical. $850,000. More money than Jeremiah had ever imagined having, more than he'd earned in his entire lifetime of work. "That's our opening offer," Torres continued. "If the survey proves even more promising than we expect, we could go higher. But I wanted to give you a solid number to work with." Jeremiah's mind raced. That much money, managed properly, could fund a community foundation for decades. Could provide scholarships, support small businesses, repair infrastructure, give Millerville the hope Doc Mercer had talked about. "I need to talk to my lawyer," Jeremiah said, his voice steadier than he felt. "But I'm interested." "Very interested," Torres nodded. "Take your time. This is a significant decision. I'll send you our formal offer in writing, along with the contract for review. Your lawyer can look it over and we can negotiate terms if needed." They shook hands, and Torres and his team drove away, leaving Jeremiah standing by the collapsed mine with Sam beside him and numbers spinning through his head. $850,000. William's dream, quantified and ready to be transformed into something new, something that would last. Something that would help people the way William had always wanted to help. Jeremiah sat down on a fallen log, suddenly feeling the weight of it all. This was real now. This was happening. And he was the one who had to make sure it happened right. Sam walked over and rested his head against Jeremiah's shoulder, warm and solid and patient. And Jeremiah, sitting in the place where his brother had died, trying to build a better future, felt tears streaming down his face. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to gratitude. 3 weeks later, Jeremiah sat in Sarah Chen's office reviewing the final draft of the foundation documents. Everything was in order. The Pike Brothers Community Foundation, named to honor both William and the brotherhood they'd shared, would be funded by the sale of the mining claim to Rockridge Resources. The paperwork was nearly complete. The offer had been accepted, and they were days away from closing the deal. Sarah was explaining the distribution plan when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's the title company," she said. "They were supposed to finish their research yesterday." "Let me take this." Jeremiah nodded and turned to look out the window while Sarah answered. He could hear her side of the conversation, mostly yes and "I see" and "when did you discover this?" As in the tone of her voice shifted from professional to concerned. When she hung up, her expression was troubled. "We have a problem," she said slowly. "A significant one." Jeremiah felt his stomach drop. "What kind of problem?" "The title company found something in their research. Something that affects the validity of the claim. Sarah pulled out a file and opened it, scanning the contents. According to their investigation, there's a competing claim on the same property, filed 3 months before William's claim by someone named Robert Grayson. That's impossible, Jeremiah said. William's claim was registered. I have the deed. It's been legally his for 40 years. I know, Sarah said. But apparently Grayson filed his claim with the county, and there was some kind of administrative error that allowed William's claim to be filed on the same parcel. The error went unnoticed for decades because neither claim was actively worked after 1983. But now that we're trying to sell, the title search has uncovered the conflict. Jeremiah's mind raced. What does this mean? It means we can't sell the claim until the ownership is clarified. It could mean that William never legally owned it. It could mean the value has to be split between 2 claimants. Or it could mean, if we can prove William's claim has priority for some reason, that we proceed as planned. But we need to investigate, and that takes time. How much time? Sarah hesitated. Weeks, possibly months. We need to track down Robert Grayson or his heirs, review all the original filing documents, possibly go to court if there's a dispute. And Rockridge Resources won't move forward until the title is clear. Jeremiah sat back in his chair, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him. Everything he'd planned, everything he'd hoped to build in William's memory, was suddenly in jeopardy. Can you find this Grayson? He asked. We can try, Sarah said. I'll start with county records, see if he's still alive or if there are descendants. But Jeremiah, I have to be honest with you, this could go either way. We might resolve it quickly, or we might end up in a legal battle that costs more than the claim is worth. Jeremiah drove back to the mountain in a daze. He'd been so close, had seen the path forward so clearly. And now this, a name from the past, a filing error, a ghost rising up to claim what William had worked for. When he got home, he found Sam waiting by the gate, patient as always. Jeremiah walked over and buried his face in the donkey's neck, letting himself feel the full weight of disappointment. There's a problem, he said quietly. Someone else might own the claim, might have owned it all along. Everything we've been working toward might be built on sand. Sam stood steady, offering silent comfort, and Jeremiah stayed there until the sun started to set. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about William, about the journal entries that mentioned the claim, about how proud his brother had been of what he'd built. Had William known about the competing claim? Had he discovered the error and chosen to work the mine anyway? Or had he died not knowing that his dream might have been built on disputed ground? The next morning, Jeremiah called Doc Mercer and explained the situation. The old physician listened without interrupting, and when Jeremiah finished, he was quiet for a moment. You know, Doc Mercer said finally, Robert Grayson's name sounds familiar. Let me ask around. I've been in this area long enough that someone might remember him. 2 days later, Doc Mercer called back. Found something. Robert Grayson died in 1991. He had a daughter named Margaret, who moved to Billings after he passed. I got her number from the county clerk. Thought you might want to talk to her directly before the lawyers get involved. Jeremiah's hands shook as he wrote down the number. This woman, Margaret Grayson, might hold the key to everything, might be willing to work with him, or might fight for what she believed was her father's legacy. He waited until evening to call, rehearsing what he'd say. When a woman's voice answered, cautious and questioning, Jeremiah took a deep breath. Miss Grayson, my name is Jeremiah Pike. I'm calling about a mining claim in the Tobacco Root Mountains. I believe your father filed a claim there in 1983. There was a pause. Who are you? My brother William worked a claim in the same area. He died in a mining accident that year. I've only recently learned about it, and I'm trying to sort out some legal issues with the property. Another pause, longer this time. Your brother was William Pike? Yes, ma'am. I need to tell you something, Margaret said, and her voice had changed, grown softer. Something my father told me before he died. Can you meet me? I think we need to talk in person. They arranged to meet at a diner in Butte the following afternoon. Jeremiah arrived early, nervous and uncertain. When Margaret walked in, he recognized her immediately. not because he'd met her before, but because she carried herself with the same kind of weathered grace he saw in the older women of Millerville. She was probably in her 60s, with grey hair and kind eyes. She sat down across from him and got right to the point. "My father filed that claim in March of 1983, she said. "He was a prospector like your brother. But he filed it wrong, put down coordinates that were off by half a mile. He realized his mistake 2 weeks later, but by then, your brother had filed on the correct location." Jeremiah leaned forward. "So William's claim was legitimate?" "Legally, yes. My father knew that. But here's the thing. He and your brother met. Talked about it. My father admitted his error, said he had no legal standing to contest it. And your brother, William, he offered my father a partnership, said there was enough gold for both of them, that they could work the claim together and split whatever they found." Jeremiah felt something shift in his chest. That sounded like William. That sounded exactly like something his brother would do. "My father accepted," Margaret continued. "Then they shook hands on it. Worked together for 6 months. Became friends. My father said William was one of the finest men he'd ever met. And then," she stopped, her voice catching. "Then the accident happened. My father was there that day. He tried to save William, dug until his hands bled. But they couldn't reach him in time." Tears were streaming down her face now. "My father never got over it. Never went back to the mine. He left Montana shortly after and never spoke about it except once, right before he died. He told me about William, about the partnership, about how guilty he felt that he'd survived when William hadn't, and he made me promise something." "What?" Jeremiah asked, his own voice rough with emotion. "He made me promise that if anyone ever came asking about that claim, if William's family ever showed up, I was to tell them the truth. That my father had no legal right to it, that it belonged to William, and therefore to William's heirs. He said he'd lived with enough guilt, and he didn't want his mistake to take anything more from the Pike family." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This is a notarized statement from my father, written a month before he died. It confirms everything I just told you. It relinquishes any claim his estate might have to that property. It's yours, Mr. Pike. It was always yours." Jeremiah took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a legal document, signed and witnessed, stating exactly what Margaret had described. Robert Grayson, in his final months, had made sure the record was set straight. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Jeremiah asked. "I didn't know anyone was looking," Margaret said simply. "The claim had been abandoned for decades. I assumed it was forgotten. But when your lawyer started the title search, it triggered a notification to my father's estate. That's when I knew it was time to honor his wishes." They sat together for another hour, sharing stories about their fathers, 2 men who'd met briefly, who'd formed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared dreams, and who'd both been marked by the tragedy that had ended one life and haunted the other. When they finally parted, Margaret hugged Jeremiah tightly. "I'm glad you're doing something meaningful with this. My father would have been happy to know that William's dream is still alive, that it's going to help people." That's what they both wanted. Jeremiah drove back to Sarah Chen's office with the notarized statement, and she nearly cried when she read it. "This changes everything," she said. "This clears the title completely. We can move forward." But Jeremiah wasn't thinking about the money or the foundation or any of it. He was thinking about 2 men who'd met on a mountain, who'd chosen partnership over conflict, who'd shown each other kindness in a world that didn't always reward kindness. He was thinking about how the past had a way of reaching forward, how guilt could become grace, how even the mistakes we make can be redeemed if we're brave enough to make them right. And he was thinking about William, who died not knowing that his generosity to a stranger would come full circle 40 years later, clearing the way for his dream to become reality. With Robert Grayson's statement clearing the title, everything moved quickly. Sarah Chen filed the necessary paperwork. Rockridge Resources confirmed their offer, and within 2 weeks, the sale was scheduled to close. The Pike Brothers Community Foundation would become a reality, funded with $850,000. But as the closing date approached, Jeremiah found himself grappling with emotions he hadn't anticipated. This should have been a moment of pure triumph. Instead, he felt a growing sense of unease, a nagging feeling that something important remained unfinished. He tried to ignore it at first, throwing himself into the practical details. Doc Mercer had agreed to serve as the first board president, and they'd recruited 4 other trustees: Caroline from the general store, Principal Henderson from the high school, retired banker Thomas Walsh, and Elena Rodriguez, who ran the community center. Together, they'd begun drafting guidelines for grants, priorities, and accountability measures. The work was satisfying, purposeful, but the unease persisted. One evening, as Jeremiah sat on his porch with Sam beside him, he finally examined the feeling more closely. What was bothering him? What felt incomplete? The answer came slowly, like dawn breaking over the mountains. He'd told William's story to the lawyer, to the board members, to Margaret Grayson. But he hadn't told it to the people of Millerville, hadn't shared with the community the full truth of where this foundation was coming from, what it meant, what it represented. They knew the basics, that Jeremiah Pike had inherited a mining claim and was using the proceeds to fund a community foundation. But they didn't know about the letters that had never been sent, the love that had persisted across 40 years of silence, the friendship between William and Robert Grayson, the patient donkey who'd carried secrets through 4 decades. They didn't know the human story behind the money. And without that story, the foundation was just another charitable organization. It would do good work, certainly. But it wouldn't inspire, wouldn't remind people of what mattered most: connection, sacrifice, love that endured beyond death. Jeremiah made a decision. He would hold a town meeting before the closing. He would stand before his neighbors and tell them everything. Tell them about William, about the 40 years of not knowing, about the guilt that had finally found redemption. It terrified him. Jeremiah wasn't a public speaker. He'd spent the last 5 years avoiding people, keeping to himself. The thought of standing in front of the whole town and opening his heart made him physically ill, but he knew it was necessary. William's story deserved to be told, and the foundation would be stronger if people understood its roots. He mentioned the idea to Doc Mercer, who immediately supported it. "People need to hear this," the old physician said. "Need to understand that this isn't charity from some distant benefactor. It's a gift from one of their own, from a man who died trying to build something better. That matters, Jeremiah." They scheduled the meeting for the Saturday before the closing at the high school gymnasium, the only space in town large enough. Principal Henderson spread the word, and Caroline posted notices in the general store. The announcement was simple: important community meeting, the future of Millerville. As the day approached, Jeremiah's anxiety grew. He wrote notes, tried to organize his thoughts, but everything felt inadequate. How could he possibly convey in words what William had meant, what this journey had meant, what he hoped the foundation would become? The night before the meeting, he pulled out William's journal one more time. He read through the entries again, letting his brother's voice wash over him. And as he read, he realized something important. He didn't need to be eloquent. He just needed to be honest. To speak from the heart the way William had written from the heart. Saturday arrived cold and clear. Jeremiah put on his best shirt, the one he'd worn to Martha's funeral, and drove down to town with Sam secured in the truck bed. He'd decided to bring the donkey. It felt right to have Sam there, as if the donkey was part of the story that needed to be told. The parking lot was already filling when Jeremiah arrived. He saw faces he recognized and people he'd never met, younger families and older couples who'd heard about the meeting. Doc Mercer met him at the entrance. "Good turnout," he said. "Probably 200 people already inside." "You ready?" "No," Jeremiah admitted. "But I'm going to do it anyway." They'd set up a podium at center court with chairs arranged in rows. A microphone stood waiting. Jeremiah's mouth went dry looking at it. He took his seat in the front row while people continued to file in. He could hear the murmur of conversations, the scrape of chairs. His hands were shaking, and he clasped them together to keep them still. Finally, Principal Henderson stood and walked to the podium. Her commanding presence immediately quieted the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "And we've called this meeting to share some important news about our community's future. But more than that, we've called it to share a story about brotherhood, sacrifice, and the kind of love that transcends time. I'm going to ask Jeremiah Pike to tell you that story himself." Jeremiah stood on legs that felt unsteady. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces. 200 people, maybe more, all of them watching him, waiting. He cleared his throat, took a breath, and began. "Most of you know me as the man who lives up on the mountain. The one who comes to town once a month for supplies and doesn't say much. The one who lost his wife 5 years ago and hasn't quite figured out how to be part of the world again." There were nods from the crowd. "What you don't know," Jeremiah continued, his voice growing stronger, "is that 3 months ago, I bought a donkey for $10. And that donkey changed everything." He told them about Samson, about the one-eyed donkey who'd come into his life when the loneliness had become too heavy. He told them about Harlan Briggs returning with the feed sack, about the revelation of William's death, about the 40 years of not knowing. The gymnasium was completely silent. People leaned forward in their chairs. Jeremiah told them about the letters William had written but never sent, about the journal that showed a brother's love persisting across distance and silence. He told them about finding the claim, about the metal box, about the survey that revealed William had been on the edge of success. He told them about Robert Grayson, about the partnership between 2 prospectors who'd chosen friendship over conflict, about Margaret's tears as she'd handed over her father's statement. "My brother died 40 years ago, Jeremiah said, and his voice cracked with emotion. "Died trying to build something that would help me, that would give us both a better future. And for 40 years, I didn't know. Didn't know he'd died thinking about me. Didn't know he'd loved me the way I loved him." He paused, wiping at his eyes, and the silence in the gymnasium was profound. "I can't bring him back," Jeremiah continued. "Can't undo those 40 years of not knowing. But I can take what he left behind and turn it into something that honors what he tried to do. Something that helps people, that builds community, that keeps families together." He explained about the sale of the claim, about the $850,000 that would fund the Pike Brothers Community Foundation, about the plans to invest the money and use the returns to support local projects, scholarships, small businesses, infrastructure improvements. "This foundation isn't mine," Jeremiah said. "It's ours. It belongs to this community, to the people who showed me kindness when I needed it most, to the people trying to build lives here. It's William's gift to all of us, 40 years late but no less meaningful." He talked about the Board of Trustees, about the application process for grants, about transparency and accountability, and then he talked about hope. "My brother believed in hope," Jeremiah said. "Believed that hard work and kindness and persistence could overcome any obstacle. He died believing that. And I hope, that this foundation can be a testament to that belief, can be something that reminds us we're not alone, that we're connected to each other and to the people who came before us, that the work we do today can echo forward into a future we'll never see." He looked out at the crowd, at the faces young and old. "William never got to see what his dream could become," Jeremiah said. "But we can. We can take what he started and build on it. We can create something that lasts. And every time we do, every time a young person gets a scholarship, every time a business gets the support it needs, every time a family chooses to stay instead of leaving, we'll be honoring my brother. We'll be saying thank you to a man who died trying to make things better." He stepped back from the podium, exhausted and emptied out. For a moment there was silence, and then someone in the back started clapping. Then another person, then another. And suddenly, the entire gymnasium was on its feet, applause rolling like thunder. Doc Mercer came up and put a hand on his shoulder. "You did good," he said quietly. "Real good." After the meeting, people lined up to shake Jeremiah's hand, to thank him, to share their own stories. Caroline from the general store had tears streaming down her face. Principal Henderson told him about students who'd left town for lack of opportunity, who might now have a reason to return. But the moment that struck Jeremiah most deeply came from a young mother holding a small child. "My husband and I were planning to leave," she said. "Move to Bozeman where there are more jobs. But hearing this, hearing about your brother and what you're trying to do, it makes me think maybe we should give Millerville another chance. Maybe there's a future here after all." Jeremiah felt his throat tighten. "I hope so," he managed to say. "I really hope so." As the crowd dispersed, Jeremiah walked outside to where he'd parked his truck. Sam was standing in the truck bed, patient as always, and Jeremiah reached up to scratch the donkey's ears. "We did it," he whispered. "We told them about William. About you. About all of it. The closing was scheduled for Monday. Just 2 more days, and everything would be official. But standing there with Sam, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Jeremiah realized that the real work had already begun. Not the work of distributing money or funding projects, but the work of rebuilding connection, of remembering that we're all part of a larger story, of honoring the people who came before us by trying to build something worthy of their sacrifice. Monday morning arrived with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of Jeremiah's cabin. He'd barely slept the night before, his mind churning through everything that had led to this moment. Today was the closing. Today, William's dream would become something real and lasting. He fed Sam and stood with the donkey for a long while, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The light was golden and cold, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and orange. It was the kind of morning that made you believe in new beginnings, in the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. "This is it," Jeremiah said quietly, his hand resting on Sam's neck. "After today, everything changes. Everything William worked for, everything he hoped for. It becomes real." Sam turned his good eye toward Jeremiah, patient and steady as always. The donkey had been there for every step of this journey, from that first $10 purchase to this final moment of transformation. It seemed fitting that Sam would be part of today too. Jeremiah drove to Butte alone, leaving Sam at the cabin with extra hay and water. The closing was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Sarah Chen's office, and Jeremiah arrived 15 minutes early. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. He'd made his peace with what was coming. Sarah greeted him at the door, her expression warm but professional. "Big day," she said. "You ready?" "I am," Jeremiah replied, and he meant it. The conference room was set up with documents spread across a long table. Michael Torres from Rockridge Resources was already there, along with the company's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Janet Morrison. There was also a representative from the title company and a notary public who would witness the signatures. Sarah walked Jeremiah through the documents one by one. The deed transfer that would convey ownership of the mining claim to Rockridge Resources. The purchase agreement that specified the $850,000 payment. The wire transfer instructions that would move the money into the foundation's account. The articles of incorporation for the Pike Brothers Community Foundation, officially establishing it as a non-profit organization under Montana law. Jeremiah read each document carefully, even though Sarah had already explained everything multiple times. This wasn't just a business transaction. This was the culmination of 40 years of loss, of guilt, of love that had persisted even through death and distance. He wanted to understand every word, every clause, every commitment he was making. Torres was professional and courteous throughout, answering Jeremiah's questions without impatience. "I want you to know," he said at one point, "that Rockridge takes our responsibility seriously. This land will be managed according to all environmental regulations. We're not planning any immediate extraction. The mineral rights are a long-term investment. But if we ever do develop the site, we'll do it right." Jeremiah nodded. He appreciated the assurance, though in truth, what happened to the physical land mattered less to him now than what happened to William's legacy. The gold was just metal. The foundation was something that would touch lives, change futures, give people hope. The signing took nearly an hour. Each document had to be reviewed, signed, witnessed, and notarized. Jeremiah's hand cramped from writing his name so many times, but he signed each page with care, knowing that every signature was a promise to William, to the community, to himself. Finally, Sarah looked up from the last document and smiled. "That's it," she said. "The sale is complete. The Pike Brothers Community Foundation is officially established and funded." "Congratulations, Jeremiah." Torres shook his hand firmly. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Pike. What you're doing with this money, it's admirable. Your brother would be proud." The words hit Jeremiah harder than he expected. He felt his throat tighten, his eyes sting with sudden tears. "Thank you," he managed to say. "That means more than you know." After Torres and the other representatives left, Sarah sat down across from Jeremiah with 2 cups of coffee. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Jeremiah thought about it. How did he feel? Relief, certainly, satisfaction, but also something deeper, something that went beyond simple emotion. "I feel like I've kept a promise," he said finally. "A promise I didn't even know I'd made." William spent his life trying to build something that would help people, that would make a difference. And now, 40 years after he died, that's finally happening. "I feel like I've given him back what was taken from him. Not his life, but his purpose, his meaning." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You've done something remarkable. Not just the foundation, but the way you've honored your brother's memory, the way you've turned loss into legacy. That's rare, Jeremiah. That's special." They sat together for a while longer, talking about next steps. The foundation's first board meeting was scheduled for the following week. Applications for grants would open in January. There was so much work ahead. Developing programs, establishing procedures, spreading the word about what resources were available. But right now, in this moment, Jeremiah just wanted to sit with what had been accomplished. Wanted to feel the weight of it, the significance of it. Wanted to imagine William looking down from wherever he was and seeing that his dream hadn't died with him in that collapsed mine shaft. Finally, Jeremiah stood and put on his coat. "I should get back," he said. "Got a donkey waiting for me, and I imagine he's wondering what's taking so long." Sarah smiled. "Give Sam my regards. He's as much a part of this story as anyone." Jeremiah drove back to the mountain with the winter sun slanting through the truck windows. The landscape looked the same as it always had. The same pine forests, the same snow-covered slopes, the same vast sky stretching overhead. But something had changed. Something fundamental and permanent. William's death was no longer just a tragedy. It was part of a larger story, one that included redemption and purpose and hope. The foundation would carry William's name forward, would tell his story to people who'd never met him, would help families and communities in ways that honored everything he'd tried to do. When Jeremiah pulled into his driveway, Sam was waiting at the fence, just as he'd expected. The donkey's ears perked up at the sound of the truck, and he moved toward the gate with that slow, deliberate gait that had become so familiar. Jeremiah climbed out and walked straight to Sam, wrapping his arms around the donkey's neck and pressing his face into the rough, warm coat. "We did it," he whispered. "It's done. The foundation is real. William's dream is alive." Sam stood perfectly still, as if understanding the weight of the moment, and Jeremiah felt something break loose inside him, not grief this time, but something closer to joy. Pure, unexpected, overwhelming joy. He'd spent so many years carrying the weight of abandonment, the belief that he'd been forgotten, left behind. And then he'd spent months carrying the weight of grief, of loss, of time that could never be recovered. But now, standing here with this patient old donkey who'd waited 40 years to bring a message of love across the decades, Jeremiah felt light, felt free. "Come on," he said to Sam, leading the donkey toward the barn. "Let me tell you how it went." As he brushed Sam's coat and checked his hooves, Jeremiah talked through every detail of the closing. He described the conference room, the stacks of documents, the way his hand had cramped from signing his name. He talked about Torres's promise that the land would be managed responsibly, about Sarah's kindness, about the moment when everything became official, and he'd felt William's presence so strongly, it was almost like his brother was standing right there beside him. $850,000, Jeremiah said, running the brush along Sam's flank. That's how much William's work was worth. And now it's going to help people. Young people trying to get an education, families trying to stay together, businesses trying to survive. All because William refused to give up. Sam blew out a soft breath and shifted his weight, comfortable and content. You know what the strangest part is? Jeremiah continued. I spent 5 years after Martha died, thinking I had nothing left to live for. But these past 3 months, since you came into my life and brought all this with you, I felt more alive than I have in years. More connected, more purposeful. He set down the brush and moved around to look Sam in the eye, the good one, clear and brown and somehow knowing. You saved me, Jeremiah said simply. You and William together, you saved me. And I don't know if donkeys understand gratitude, but I need you to know how grateful I am. The afternoon was fading into evening now, the temperature dropping as the sun sank behind the mountains. Jeremiah led Sam back to his paddock and made sure he had fresh water and extra feed. Then he walked to the cabin, built up the fire, and sat in Martha's old rocking chair with William's journal open in his lap. He read through the entries one more time, but differently now. Before, he'd read them through the lens of grief, seeing only what had been lost. Now, he read them through the lens of completion, seeing how the story had found its ending, not the ending William had imagined, but an ending that honored everything he'd tried to build. As darkness settled over the mountain, Jeremiah made a decision. Tomorrow, he would drive back to Twin Bridges, back to the cemetery where William was buried. And he would tell his brother what had happened, would describe the town meeting, the closing, the foundation that would carry both their names forward. But tonight, he would sit by the fire and let himself feel the full measure of what had been accomplished. Let himself acknowledge that loss and redemption could exist in the same story, that grief and joy weren't opposites but companions, that the past could be honored without becoming a prison. He thought about Harlan Briggs, probably in Oregon by now, finally free of the guilt that had haunted him for 40 years. He thought about Margaret Grayson, who'd honored her father's dying wish. He thought about Doc Mercer and Caroline, and all the people of Millerville who'd shown him kindness when he'd forgotten how to accept it. And he thought about Martha, gone 5 years but still present in the way the fire crackled and the cabin creaked, and the silence held comfort instead of emptiness. She would have loved this story, would have loved knowing that Jeremiah had found his way back to the world. I wish you were here to see this, he said aloud to Martha's memory. Wish you could meet Sam, could see what's come from that $10 purchase. But I think maybe you and William are somewhere together, watching all of this, proud of what's been built from broken pieces. The fire popped and settled, and Jeremiah closed his eyes, rocking gently in the chair that still held the shape of his wife. He felt for the first time in longer than he could remember, at peace. Not because the grief was gone, it would never be fully gone, but because he'd learned to carry it differently, to let it coexist with hope and purpose and the quiet satisfaction of promises kept. Outside, he could hear the wind moving through the pines, the distant call of an owl, the soft sounds of Sam settling in for the night. The mountain held them all, the living and the dead, the grief and the joy, the past and the future, all woven together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities. But tonight, Jeremiah Pike sat in his cabin on the mountain and knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he'd done right by his brother, that William's life and death had mattered, that love, even when separated by 40 years and a wall of silence, could find its way home, and that sometimes the most unlikely messengers, a guilty man and a patient donkey, could carry the most important messages of all. The next morning, Jeremiah woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the smell of coffee he'd set to brew the night before. He dressed carefully, putting on clean clothes and the jacket Martha had given him for his 60th birthday. Today felt important, ceremonial even, and he wanted to look presentable for his brother. He loaded Sam into the truck. The donkey had become such a constant companion that leaving him behind felt wrong, and made the drive to Twin Bridges. The roads were clear, the sky impossibly blue, and everything felt charged with significance. At the cemetery, Jeremiah parked and led Sam to William's grave. The stone looked the same as it had weeks ago, simple and unadorned, but somehow it felt different now. It no longer marked just an ending. It marked a beginning too. Jeremiah knelt and placed his hand on the cold granite the way he had before. Sam stood beside him, patient and quiet. "I came to tell you it's done," Jeremiah said. "The Pike Brothers Community Foundation is real now, official, funded. Your dream, the one you died chasing, it's alive, William. It's going to help people, going to make a difference in ways you couldn't have imagined." He told William about the town meeting, about standing in front of 200 people and telling the story of two brothers separated by silence and reunited by a $10 donkey. He told him about the young mother who decided to give Millerville another chance, about the tears in Caroline's eyes, about the applause that had rolled through the gymnasium like thunder. "They know your name now," Jeremiah said. "They know what you tried to do, what you died trying to build. And they're grateful, William. They understand that you were one of them, someone trying to make a better life, someone who believed hard work and hope could overcome anything." He talked about the closing, about signing all those documents, about the moment when $850,000 became real money that would be invested and managed and used to fund scholarships and small businesses and infrastructure, improvements for generations to come. "Wish you could see what's coming," Jeremiah continued. "The first grants will go out in the spring. There's a young woman who wants to open a bakery but needs help with equipment costs. There's a boy who got accepted to engineering school but can't afford tuition. There's a plan to repair the community center roof so it can host events year-round. All of that, all of it because you didn't give up. Because you kept digging, even when the cave was unstable. Because you believed in something bigger than yourself." Sam shifted his weight and lowered his head as if paying his own respects. Jeremiah reached up and stroked the donkey's neck. "And this old boy," Jeremiah said, his voice catching, "this patient, stubborn, half-blind donkey who waited 40 years to bring your message home. He saved me, William. Saved me from disappearing into grief and loneliness. Gave me a reason to care again, to connect again, to believe that the world still had purpose and meaning." He sat there for a long while, just being present with his brother's memory. The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the dried grass and the few remaining leaves on the trees. A crow called in the distance. Time moved slowly, the way it does in places where the past feels close enough to touch. Finally, Jeremiah stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "I'll be back," he promised. "Regular now. You won't be alone here anymore. And I'll keep you updated on the foundation, on all the good that comes from what you started. You'll be part of every scholarship awarded, every business that thrives, every family that stays together because they have hope. Your name will live on, William. Your love will live on." He led Sam back to the truck, and they drove home through the mountain afternoon. When they arrived at the cabin, Doc Mercer's truck was parked in the driveway. The old physician was sitting on the porch steps waiting. "Figured you might have gone to see William," Doc Mercer said, as Jeremiah climbed out. "Wanted to catch you when you got back. Got some news." They sat together on the porch while Sam grazed nearby. Doc Mercer pulled out a folder and opened it. "Had our first board meeting this morning," he said. "Made some preliminary decisions about grant priorities. And the board voted unanimously on something. We want you to approve it." He handed Jeremiah a document. It was a proposal to name the first scholarship program after Martha Pike, in recognition of the role she'd played in Jeremiah's life and the love that had sustained him through grief. "The Martha Pike Memorial Scholarship," Doc Mercer said. "For students who've lost a parent but are determined to build a future anyway. Seemed fitting, given how Martha's love helped you survive losing her, and how William's love helped you survive losing him." Jeremiah felt tears streaming down his face. He couldn't speak, could only nod. "There's more," Doc Mercer continued gently. We want to commission a plaque for the town hall, something that tells William's story, that explains where the foundation came from. And we want to include Sam, want people to know about the $10 donkey who carried a 40-year-old message of love across time. That's part of our history now, a part of who we are. Jeremiah found his voice. William would like that. And Martha, she'd be honored. They sat together as the afternoon faded, talking about the future, about the grants that would be awarded, the lives that would be changed, the ripples that would spread outward from this one act of turning loss into legacy, about how communities survived by remembering, by honoring their dead through service to the living, by understanding that we're all connected across time and circumstance. When Doc Mercer finally left, Jeremiah walked out to where Sam stood by the fence. The donkey turned his good eye toward him, patient as always, and Jeremiah rested his forehead against Sam's neck. "We did it," he whispered. "We brought William home. We made his dream real. And now we get to watch it grow." The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jeremiah stood there with Sam, watching the light change, feeling the weight of the past settling into something bearable, something beautiful even. He thought about the journey that had started with $10 and a lonely man's need for companionship, about how small acts of faith could change everything, about how love persisted even through death and distance and decades of silence, about how the work we do in this life echoes forward in ways we can't predict or control. William was gone, had been gone for 40 years. Martha was gone, had been gone for 5. But they weren't finished. Their love continued, their influence continued, their legacy continued through the foundation and the scholarships and the lives that would be touched by what Jeremiah had built. From their memory, the mountain wind carried the scent of pine and snow in coming winter. Jeremiah breathed it in deeply, feeling more alive, more connected, more purposeful than he had in longer than he could remember. Tomorrow would bring new work. The foundation would open for applications, the grants would be reviewed, the community would begin the long process of rebuilding hope. But tonight, Jeremiah Pike stood on his mountain with a half-blind donkey beside him and felt, for the first time in years, like he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, honoring the people he'd loved by helping others learn to love and hope and persevere. And that, he realized, was more than enough.